A while back, I asked viewers of this channel for topic ideas, and one of the topics that came up repeatedly was competition. Do you need to compete in order to earn rank in jiu-jitsu? Should you compete? What are the upsides to competing? What are the downsides to competing? So I thought today that would make a great topic. So let's talk about it. Unless you've been living in a cave with no Wi-Fi, then certainly you've heard me advertising something called Old Grappler Summit. It's a 3-day jiu-jitsu and social gathering down here in San Diego, California for the over 40 grappler. We were full, we were maxed out, and I still had a bunch of people that wanted to get in on it, so we were able to free up some space and reconfigure some things in order to allow more participants. Most of those slots are full now, but we still have 2 or 3 slots left. So if you're interested, I suggest you act quickly. Just go to rickellis.com and click the events tab. And while you're there, you can look at my jiu-jitsu courses and some of the other stuff that I do. And I look forward to meeting you and training with you. Okay, let's talk about competition. And probably the best place to begin is to answer the question, do you have to compete in order to earn rank in jiu-jitsu? Do you need to compete to earn a blue belt, a purple belt, and so on? Generally, the answer is no. Globally, at most academies, generally the answer is no, not just in jiu-jitsu. In most martial arts, you're not required to compete in jiu-jitsu. It's really a small percentage of people that train a martial art that actually compete, and in jiu-jitsu it's probably less than 20%. And of that 20% that compete, probably most of those people only do a handful of competitions throughout their entire jiu-jitsu journey. It's rare to find somebody that competes as a lifestyle or that sees competition as a path for them to reach, achieve some fame and notoriety in jiu-jitsu. So no, you don't have to compete. Now, some schools do require it, and there's some nuance there. I've never required my students to compete, but with some students, I do make an exception and I do require them to compete. And you might ask, why do you require it of some students and not other students? And the answer to that, I'm going to quote the Bible, for whom much is given, much is required. So if you're young and strong and athletic, and you have a good mind for jiu-jitsu, and you have the ability to train very frequently, then I'm going to hold you at a higher standard. I'm going to hold you to a standard that requires you to give me everything you have. Whereas with other students, they might be giving me everything they have, but they have limited upside. Maybe they are 35, 40 years old, they've got a career, they've got family, they've got obligations, they have other interests, they have limited time. Well, that guy might only be able to train 2 or 3 days a week, but they're giving me everything they have, whereas this guy has, ample time to train, so I'm going to hold them to a higher standard. Jiu-jitsu is very easy for a lot of people, for those young athletic guys that are strong, and, we've all felt those guys on the jiu-jitsu mat. For them, getting the tap and being dominant comes relatively easy. For someone who is smaller and weaker and older, success comes much, much harder. They have to work much harder for success than someone else. So I'm the guys that have it a little bit easier, I'm generally going to hold them to a higher standard. Not that everybody doesn't have to meet a baseline threshold for what that belt means. There's an objective standard that I believe each belt should represent in terms of your performance on the mat and in terms of your knowledge of jiu-jitsu and your execution of jiu-jitsu technically. But if you meet that base level requirement, training 2 days a week over 3 years, well, I'm not going to hold you back. But this guy who can train 6 days a week, ultimately they're going to be a lot better, and I'm going to push them to get a lot better. So that's my personal philosophy. I don't know if other schools do it that way. Now, should you compete? That's the next question. Well, I think that all jiu-jitsu practitioners should at least do a few competitions throughout their journey. Even if you're someone that is not interested in competing, I suggest that everybody should do at least a handful. Why? Well, for one thing, you're going to learn a lot about yourself. And it's also, I think, probably the closest thing to what we will ever experience if we were to get into a street fight or a self-defense encounter. Most of us are never going to have to defend our lives. I've certainly never had to, defend my life. I've never been attacked. I've never had to use my jujitsu in self-defense. And so how do you pressure test your jujitsu? Really, competition is the only way to pressure test a martial art. And there are martial arts out there where you don't spar, and there are martial arts out there where you do spar, and the ones where you do spar tend to be arts that are highly effective. The arts where you don't spar tend to be largely ineffective when you're going against a resisting opponent. And the only real way to pressure test that, of course, we go hard, we train hard in the training room every day, of course, but there's a higher level of intensity and pressure that comes with competing that is going to kind of mimic what you're going to feel in a self-defense situation much more. You're going to have an adrenaline dump. You're going to have nerves. There's going to be the urgency of the moment. Everybody's watching. And so I think for a lot of people, they would benefit from feeling that. And I guess you have to ask the question, why don't you want to compete? And I think for a lot of people, if they're honest with themselves, the answer is they're scared. They're scared to test themselves. They're scared to fail. And well, that's a great reason to compete, because if you're scared to, well, that falls under the category of performance anxiety. Something like stage fright, if you're a musician, is performance anxiety. If you're a basketball player and you get fouled and you have to go to the free throw line and make some free throws under pressure and you choke, well, that's performance anxiety. If you get nervous coming to class before training and you're just nervous, well, that's performance anxiety. And what that is your prefrontal cortex being a little too activated, and you're not as relaxed as you should be. And so how do you perform your best, whether it's competition or in any other domain, music, whatever? The way you perform your best is by finding that sweet spot between tension and relaxation. If you're too tense or too adrenalized or too activated, you're not going to perform your best. If you're too relaxed, you're not going to perform your best. And John Danaher talks about this. He talks about the continuum between relaxation and tension and how we are always somewhere in that continuum when we train jiu-jitsu. But in a competition, it has a tendency of skewing that toward the activation side and not the relaxation side. And so by competing, you will ease those nerves by competing more frequently and putting yourself in a situation where competition is kind of mundane because you've done it a bunch. Well, that's where you'll be able to find that sweet spot a lot better. We've all seen combat athletes, UFC athletes or whatever, just get super jacked up and they're slapping themselves and they come out into the octagon super adrenalized. Usually they don't do very well. It's the guys that are more calm and focused that do better. So that's going to be a benefit of competition, is that it's going to help you really discover a lot of things about yourself. There's that old expression, you either win or you learn. And that's very true, because if you lose in competition, it's arguably you are going to learn more than if you win, because if you win, what's there to improve? You were the best. Whereas if you lose, there are always things that you're going to have to take home with you and sort out. And also, it teaches you that win, lose, or draw, you need to lose with grace. You need to win with grace. And, what does it really mean to lose in competition or to win in competition? Because at most competitions, it's just a few random people that show up that day. And what does it really mean? Well, it means whatever you make it mean to you. If it means the world, then you're going to be crushed if you lose. Whereas if you're a little more stoic and you feel like, listen, I'm just going to test myself. I'm going to do my best. I'm going to do everything I can to win, but it's not entirely under my control. And if I lose, well, there's going to be more to work on. So you'll learn about yourself and you'll discover things about yourself that you should improve. And those things are really positive. And so ask yourself why you're not interested in competing. And it could be that you're not scared or anything. You just have no interest in competing. You feel like you compete every day on the mat. You're doing jiu-jitsu for the health benefits and for the self-defense benefits and those things, and you feel like you're getting those things. Well, that's fine. Then you don't have to compete. It's always valuable, but it's not necessary or mandatory for everybody. The last thing I will say about competition is that it's a phenomenal external motivator. There's a tendency for jiu-jitsu practitioners to become pretty comfortable and complacent at whatever belt level you have been at for a while, right? It's super common to have imposter syndrome. You get your blue belt, you get your purple belt, you're awarded your brown belt, and you don't feel like you're worthy of that. You're like, oh man, I don't feel like I'm worthy. Well, that's great. I think imposter syndrome is a very valuable thing because it forces you to step up your game and to definitively be that next level. And if you don't feel like it initially, well, it's going to motivate you. It's an external motivator. And sometimes as a coach with some students, they might be at that level technically for the next belt level, but they're not really giving you the effort that they should be giving you. And sometimes with those people, you'll actually promote them because you know it's going to put the fear of the Lord into them and they're going to step it up. And now they're going to be that next level because you've given them the belt. But once you've been a blue belt for 2 years or purple for a year or two, man, you are comfortable there. And you might not feel any urgency to step up your game to get to the next level. And in fact, you might not want to get to the next level because you're real comfortable at that belt level. And a competition, a jiu-jitsu competition, is a way to create an external motivator that's going to force you to ramp up your training, scale up your training, train with more purpose, train with more intensity, train with more volume and frequency, and also step up your physical preparation for the competition, because if you don't go in shape, you're not going to do well. I'm a huge fan of external motivators. I think that internal motivation tends to be real fickle. You join a health club and then 3 weeks later, you're not in the mood to go and then you never go back. Well, that's because you're relying on an internal motivator, and internal motivators are terrible. I mean, if you listen to what your brain tells you to do, and we've talked about this on the channel before, we've talked about how your brain tightly controls energy production. What it wants is homeostasis, which is a stable state. And so if you're feeling unmotivated to go work out, it's just your brain trying to convince you to conserve energy for some physiological benefit. But when you know you have to compete in 8 weeks, that has a tendency to get your attention, so you do the work necessary to get to that next level. So I think those are my main thoughts about competing. I don't think you have to compete if you don't want to. I think that there are benefits to competing that I've outlined. There's some downsides to competition. There's higher injury potential, for sure. There's higher injury potential, and you can see that every time you go to a competition, there are injuries. And sometimes there are injuries leading up to competition. I have never been injured in competition, but I have certainly injured myself preparing for competition or preparing for some, a next belt test, or, preparing for something that requires you to really hammer hard and do your strength and conditioning and roll with more purpose. And if you're an older athlete and maybe you were an athlete when you were young and you're just beat up from that, and you're doing well to just be on the mat frequently. I mean, don't feel extra pressure that you have to compete. It's not mandatory, even though I do think it's going to provide a lot of benefits. And there's some risk. There's some risk in doing so as well. So those are my thoughts. I don't know if I answered all the questions related to competition. I'm curious to hear your thoughts down below. What do you think about competition? Should you be required to compete to earn a belt in jiu-jitsu? It's an interesting subject. All right. I look forward to talking to you next time.